They called her a thief to save a rich man's reputation. Now Martha Bell stood in the mud outside the only town she'd ever known, sold like livestock to a stranger heading west, while the good people of Thornbury watched from their windows and whispered that she'd finally gotten what women like her deserved. But sometimes the cruelest exile leads to the one place you were always meant to be, and the one person brave enough to see you as you truly are. This is the story of a woman who learned to take up space in a world that wanted her invisible. If you're still watching at the end, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Martha's story travels. The morning they decided Martha Bell had to go, the sky hung low and gray over Thornbury like a lid on a pot about to boil over. She stood at the washing tubs behind the Grand Hotel with her hands submerged in water so cold it made her knuckles ache, scrubbing at the shirt collars of men who wouldn't meet her eyes on the street. 28 years she'd lived in this town, and for most of them, she'd been as much a part of the landscape as the horse troughs and hitching posts, necessary, unremarkable, easily ignored. Martha was a big woman, broad-shouldered and strong-bodied, the kind of build that came from hauling wet laundry and buckets of water since she was 12 years old. Her hands were raw and red, her back perpetually sore, but she moved with a quiet efficiency that made the work look easier than it was. She wore her brown hair pulled back tight, her dresses plain and dark, and she'd learned long ago to make herself as small as possible despite her size, to speak softly, to lower her eyes, to take up only the space absolutely necessary. The women of Thornbury had their own language for describing her. Sturdy, they'd say, which meant unfeminine. Big-boned, which meant fat. Plain, which meant unworthy of desire or tenderness. The men simply didn't see her at all, except when they needed their shirts cleaned or their floors scrubbed, and then she became a pair of capable hands attached to a body they preferred not to acknowledge. She'd made peace with it, mostly. She had a room in the boarding house, barely more than a closet with a narrow bed, and she earned enough to eat, though Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house made pointed comments about how much someone Martha's size must consume. She had no family left. Her mother had died when Martha was 16, worn out from the same kind of labor that was slowly wearing Martha down. Her father had disappeared years before that. If he'd ever existed at all beyond the shame her mother carried, this particular morning had started like any other. Martha had risen before dawn, dressed in the dim light, and made her way to the hotel's back courtyard where the washing tubs waited. She'd built up the fire under the largest kettle, hauled water from the pump, and begun the day's work. Mondays were always the worst, sheets and tablecloths from the weekend, stained with wine and food and things she tried not to think about. She was working on a particularly stubborn stain when she heard the voices. Men's voices, low and urgent, coming from the alley that ran between the hotel and the bank. Martha knew better than to pay attention to things that weren't her business, but something in the tone made her pause, her hands still in the water. "Can't have it getting out," one voice said. She recognized it, Mr. Garrett, who owned the bank and half the businesses on Main Street. "My reputation would be ruined," the girl saw something. That was Sheriff Coleman, his voice flat and practical. "She'll talk eventually." "They always do," Martha's breath caught. She knew immediately what they were discussing. 2 days ago, she'd been cleaning the private dining room at the hotel when Mr. Garrett had entered with a woman who was very much not Mrs. Garrett. They'd been so wrapped up in each other that they hadn't noticed Martha in the corner, and she'd slipped out as quietly as she'd come in. She hadn't told anyone. She never told anyone anything. But apparently, someone had seen her leaving the room. "We need to handle this quietly," Mr. Garrett continued. "I have a business proposition with the territorial governor next month. I can't have any whispers about impropriety. What do you suggest?" the sheriff asked. "There's a man heading west tomorrow, looking for help at his ranch. Need someone who can cook and clean. I'll pay her passage and 3 months' wages in advance. By the time anyone asks where she went, she'll be too far away to matter." Martha's heart began to pound. They were talking about sending her away. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because her presence had become inconvenient, what about the theft? Sheriff Coleman asked, what theft? There was amusement in Mr. Garrett's voice. The theft we're going to discover. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her silver tea service has been looking tarnished lately. I imagine when we search the Bell girl's room, we'll find a piece or two she's been helping herself to. Sticky fingers often go with women of her appetites. The casual cruelty of it took Martha's breath away. They were going to plant evidence in her room. They were going to make her a thief so no one would question her sudden departure or believe anything she said if she ever tried to come back. She should have run then. Should have slipped away and tried to disappear into the countryside. But where would she go? She had no money, no horse, no family. And some part of her, the part that had been taught since birth that she was lucky to have anything at all, whispered that maybe it would be better out west. Maybe anywhere would be better than here, so she stayed at her tubs and kept washing clothes, even as her hands trembled and her mind raced. When Mrs. Henderson came to fetch her an hour later, Martha followed without protest to the boarding house, where Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies were waiting in her tiny room. They'd already found what they'd come to find, a silver spoon tucked under her mattress, glinting in the morning light like an accusation. Martha stared at it, this thing she'd never touched, this lie made solid, and felt something inside her crack. Martha Bell, Sheriff Coleman said with theatrical solemnity, you're under arrest for theft. The gathering that followed had the appearance of justice but the reality of theater. The whole town seemed to materialize in the space of an hour, drawn by the spectacle of the big girl from the laundry finally being put in her place. They assembled in front of the general store, where Mr. Garrett stood on the steps like a judge, his face arranged in an expression of sorrowful disappointment. Martha stood in the center of it all, still wearing her wet apron, her hands red and raw from the morning's work. She didn't try to defend herself. What would be the point? Who would believe her? This is a sad day, Mr. Garrett announced to the crowd. Martha Bell has been a part of this community for many years. To discover that she's been stealing from the very people who provided for her. He shook his head. However, I am not without mercy. Rather than see her imprisoned or publicly punished, I've arranged for her to go west, to work for a rancher who needs help. She'll leave tomorrow morning. I trust the good people of Thornberry will join me in praying for her redemption. The crowd murmured its approval. Martha could see it in their faces, the satisfaction of having their worst suspicions confirmed. Of course the big girl was a thief. Greed explained everything about her, didn't it? Her size, her poverty, her unmarried state. She'd probably been stealing for years. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face pinched with righteous anger. I took her in when no one else would. Fed her, gave her a roof over her head. And this is how she repays me. Martha wanted to laugh. Fed her. She'd paid for every meal, and Mrs. Henderson had charged her twice what anyone else would have. But she stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Pack your things, Sheriff Coleman told her. You leave at first light. That night, Martha sat in her room. They'd allowed her one final night there, a magnanimous gesture that felt more like torture, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Her entire life fit into a single canvas bag. 2 dresses, a nightgown, a shawl her mother had made, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing. It took her less than 5 minutes to pack. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Footsteps in the hallway. Muffled voices. The creak of bed frames. The ordinary sounds of other people's ordinary lives, lives that would continue exactly as they had been while she vanished into the west like smoke. Just before dawn, she allowed herself one moment of weakness. She cried, quietly, her face buried in her hands so no one would hear. Not for what she was losing, there was nothing here worth mourning, but for what it meant that they could do this to her and face no consequences. That her life could be discarded so easily. That she'd spent 28 years trying to be good enough. Small enough, quiet enough, and it hadn't mattered at all. when the tears stopped, she washed her face in the basin, pinned up her hair, and picked up her bag. The sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue. Sheriff Coleman was waiting outside with a wagon and a man Martha had never seen before. The stranger was tall and weathered, maybe 40, with a beard shot through with gray and eyes that assessed her with neither kindness nor cruelty, just a sort of tired resignation. He wore a dusty coat and a hat pulled low, and he didn't offer his name. "This is her," he asked the sheriff, "Martha Bell. She's strong, a hard worker. She'll earn her keep." The man looked at Martha for a long moment. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look down or apologize for taking up space in his line of sight. If she was being sold, she'd at least face it with her eyes open. "Get in," he said finally, gesturing to the wagon. Martha climbed up, settling her bag beside her. The wood was rough under her hands, the seat hard and narrow. As the wagon began to move, she looked back at Thornberry one last time. A few windows glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose from morning fires. The town was waking up to a day that would be exactly like every other day, except she wouldn't be in it. No one came to see her off. No one waved or called goodbye or showed even a flicker of regret. Martha Bell was leaving. And Thornberry was already forgetting she'd ever existed. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the wagon wheels crunching over the dirt road, the sun climbing slowly above the horizon. The land around them was brown and dry, dotted with sage and scrub. Mountains rose in the distance, purple in the morning light. Finally, the man spoke. "Name's Fletcher. I'm taking you as far as Broken Creek. The man you'll be working for will meet us there." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. "Garrett paid me to transport you. Said you're a thief." Fletcher's tone was matter-of-fact. "Don't matter to me either way. Just don't steal from me, and we'll get along fine. I didn't steal anything." Martha said quietly. Fletcher shrugged. "Like I said. Don't matter to me." They stopped twice to rest the horses and ate jerky and hard bread from Fletcher's supplies. He didn't talk much, and Martha was grateful for it. She had no desire to explain herself or hear whatever advice or judgment he might offer. She just wanted to get wherever she was going and figure out what came next. By late afternoon, the landscape had changed. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and trees appeared, cottonwoods and willows near a creek that ran parallel to the road. Fletcher turned the wagon off the main track and followed the water until they reached a small settlement. Calling it a town would have been generous. Broken Creek consisted of a trading post, a livery stable, and a handful of rough buildings that might have been homes or might have been abandoned. A few people moved between the structures, and they looked up as the wagon approached with the wary interest of people who saw strangers rarely and trusted them even less. Fletcher pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the trading post. "Wait here," he told Martha, and disappeared inside. Martha sat in the wagon and tried not to feel like livestock waiting to be inspected. Her back ached from the long ride, and her throat was dry. The sun was starting to sink toward the western mountains, and the air had taken on the cool edge of evening. Fletcher emerged a few minutes later with another man. This one was younger, maybe mid-30s, dressed in worn work clothes. His dark hair was too long, his face unshaven, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of weariness that went bone deep. "This is Caleb Harlan," Fletcher said. "He's the one you'll be working for." Caleb looked at Martha with eyes that were startlingly blue against his tanned skin. She couldn't read his expression. There was no welcome in it, but no hostility either. Just a kind of blank assessment, as if he were looking at a tool he'd ordered and was trying to decide whether it would do the job. "You know how to cook?" he asked. "Yes, clean. Mend clothes. Handle chickens?" "Yes," he nodded slowly. "I have a ranch about 3 hours from here. It's remote. Nearest neighbor is a half-day's ride. No town nearby, no church, no women's society or any of that. Just work. I'll pay you room and board and $5 a month. You'll have your own space. I won't bother you, and I expect you won't bother me. If that suits you, get your things." Martha climbed down from Fletcher's wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. She took her bag and stood beside Caleb's horse and wagon, which looked even more worn than Fletcher's. Caleb handed Fletcher some coins, and the two men nodded at each other in that way men did when they'd concluded business. Then Fletcher climbed back into his wagon and, without a word to Martha, turned and headed back the way they'd come. "Get in," Caleb said, and Martha climbed up beside him, as they pulled away from Broken Creek, heading toward the mountains that now loomed large and dark against the evening sky. Martha realized she hadn't even asked where she was going. What kind of man Caleb Harlan was. Whether she'd be safe or in danger. It didn't matter. She had nowhere else to go and no way to get there. Whatever waited for her in those mountains couldn't be worse than what she'd left behind. At least, that's what she told herself as the wagon rolled west into the gathering darkness, carrying her toward a life she couldn't imagine and a man she didn't know. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, following a narrow track that seemed more like a suggestion than an actual path. Pine trees crowded close on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what remained of the daylight. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful she'd thought to wear it despite the morning heat. Caleb hadn't spoken since they'd left Broken Creek. He sat beside her on the wagon seat, his attention fixed on the horses and the treacherous road ahead. Martha studied him from the corner of her eye, trying to understand what kind of man would live so far from civilization and what kind of desperation or necessity would drive him to pay for a stranger's help. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them daily. There was a stiffness in the way he held himself, as if he carried an injury that had healed poorly. And there was something else, something in the set of his jaw and the shadows under his eyes, that spoke of grief or trauma or both. "Watch yourself," he said suddenly as the wagon lurched over a particularly rough section of trail. Martha grabbed the seat to steady herself, her heart jumping at the unexpected sound of his voice. They continued in silence for another hour as full darkness fell. The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light through the trees and making the shadows between them seem deeper and more threatening. Martha could hear things moving in the forest, the rustle of small animals, the hoot of an owl, sounds she couldn't identify that made her skin prickle with primitive fear. Just when she'd started to wonder if they'd be traveling all night, Caleb guided the horses around a bend and a clearing opened before them. A cabin sat in the center, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney rising from one end. There was a barn nearby, smaller than she'd expected, and a chicken coop that looked like it was held together more by hope than nails. The whole place had an air of barely managed survival, of a man fighting a losing battle against the wilderness. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin and climbed down without a word. Martha sat there for a moment, uncertain whether she should follow or wait to be invited. When Caleb disappeared into the barn with the horses, she decided waiting was foolish and climbed down on her own, her legs trembling with fatigue. She stood in the yard and looked around, trying to orient herself in the moonlight. Besides the cabin and barn, she could make out what looked like a root cellar built into the hillside and a woodpile covered with a tarp. Everything was neat enough, organized in the way of someone who lived alone and had no one else to blame if things went wrong. Caleb emerged from the barn and walked past her to the cabin. He opened the door and went inside, and after a moment, light bloomed in the windows as he lit a lamp. Martha picked up her bag and followed, stepping through the doorway into what would apparently be her new home. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft overhead. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple cook stove beside it. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding dishes and supplies, and in the far corner, a bed that looked like it had been built by someone with more determination than carpentry skill. The floor was packed earth covered here and there with worn rugs. Everything was clean but stark, functional without any hint of comfort or decoration. "You'll sleep up there," Caleb said, gesturing to the loft. "There's a mattress and blankets. I sleep down here." Privy's out back. Water comes from the creek, there's a bucket by the door. You'll need to boil it before drinking. Martha nodded, setting her bag down near the ladder that led to the loft. Caleb moved to the shelves and pulled down a few items: bread, dried meat, a jar of something Martha couldn't identify in the lamplight. He set them on the table with 2 tin plates and 2 cups. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yes," Martha admitted. She'd eaten nothing but Fletcher's jerky and hard bread all day. They sat at the table in uncomfortable silence, and Martha forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. The bread was stale but edible, the meat tough but flavorful. Caleb ate mechanically, as if it were just another task to complete, and when he finished, he stood and went to a cabinet near the door. He returned with a bundle of cloth and set it on the table. "These were my wife's," he said. "She was bigger than most women. They might fit you better than what you're wearing." Martha stared at the bundle, then at Caleb. "Your wife, she died 2 years ago." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were discussing the weather. "Her things are just taking up space. You might as well use them." Before Martha could respond, he turned and walked to the door. "I'll be in the barn for a while. Get settled." Then he was gone, leaving Martha alone in the cabin with a dead woman's clothes and more questions than answers. She sat at the table for a long moment, her hands wrapped around the tin cup, trying to process everything that had happened in the past day. Yesterday morning, she'd been washing laundry in Thornbury. Now she was sitting in a mountain cabin belonging to a widower who barely spoke, surrounded by the possessions of a woman she'd never met. Eventually, exhaustion won out over confusion. Martha climbed the ladder to the loft and found, as Caleb had said, a mattress and a pile of blankets. The space was small, she couldn't stand upright, but it was clean and private. She could hear rain beginning to fall on the roof, a gentle pattering that somehow made the cabin feel more isolated and more sheltered at the same time. She lay down without changing her clothes and pulled a blanket over herself. Through the small window near the mattress, she could see the barn, and in its doorway, the shadow of Caleb standing motionless in the rain. Watching something she couldn't see. Or maybe watching nothing at all. Martha closed her eyes and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the loft window and the smell of coffee. Her body ached from the previous day's travel and from sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress. And for a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned, the false accusation, the journey west, the silent man and his isolated cabin. Martha climbed down the ladder to find Caleb standing at the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. He glanced at her briefly, then gestured to the table. "Sit. We need to talk about how things work here." She sat, accepting the cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, but hot, and she wrapped her cold hands around it gratefully. Caleb remained standing, leaning against the wall with his own cup. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd thought the night before, probably not much past 35. But he carried himself like an older man, weighed down by something invisible. There was a scar on his left cheek, faded but still visible, and his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare she'd seen on veterans who'd come through Thornbury after the war. "I work the ranch alone," he said. "I've got about 50 head of cattle scattered in the hills, some horses, the chickens you saw. I spend most days out checking on them, mending fences, hunting. Sometimes I'm gone overnight. I need someone here to keep the place running, cook meals, tend the chickens, keep the cabin clean, preserve food when there's excess. In winter, there's less to do outside, but you'll need to help with the animals when the weather's bad." Martha nodded, listening. "I don't expect you to like me or want to talk to me," Caleb continued. "I don't need a friend or a companion. I need help keeping this place from falling apart. In return, you'll have food, shelter, and pay. That's the arrangement." "What happened to your last help?" Martha asked, surprised by her own boldness. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Didn't have any. Been doing it myself since Sarah died. But I'm getting older, and the work's getting harder. Seemed like time to get help before I broke my neck or starved because I was too tired to cook. Why so far from town? Why not somewhere easier? For the first time, something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Not anger exactly, but a hardness that made Martha wish she'd kept quiet. People have their reasons for going far from towns, he said. I have mine. So do you, I imagine, or you wouldn't have agreed to come here without asking questions. It was a fair point. Martha looked down at her coffee. The work starts now, Caleb said. I'll show you around, then I need to head up to the north pasture. There's a cow that's been acting strange, might be sick. I'll be back by evening. He set his empty cup on the table and headed for the door, clearly expecting her to follow. Martha drained her own coffee quickly and grabbed her shawl before stepping out into the cool morning air. The rain had stopped. But everything was wet and glistening. The forest pressed close on three sides of the clearing, dark and dense, while the fourth side opened onto a meadow that sloped down toward a creek. The morning mist was just beginning to lift, revealing mountains in the distance, their peaks still white with snow. Caleb walked her through the daily routine with the efficiency of a military officer giving orders. The chickens needed to be fed and watered, their eggs collected. The water bucket needed to be filled from the creek twice a day and boiled for drinking. Firewood needed to be brought in and kept dry. There was a garden plot behind the cabin, overgrown now, that would need tending come spring. The root cellar held preserved vegetables, dried meat, flour, sugar, enough to get through the winter if they were careful. You know how to shoot? Caleb asked as they stood near the barn. No, he nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then stay close to the cabin when I'm gone. There's bears and mountain lions in these hills. They usually avoid people, but not always. If you see one, get inside and stay there until it leaves. The casual mention of predators made Martha's stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. Any questions? Caleb asked. Martha had 100 questions, but none she thought he'd answer. So she just shook her head. Good. I'll be back before dark. She watched him saddle a horse in the barn, strap a rifle to his saddle, and ride off into the trees without a backward glance. Then she was alone in the clearing, surrounded by forest and mountains and a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. For a moment, Martha stood frozen, overwhelmed by the isolation and strangeness of it all. Then she took a breath, squared her shoulders, and got to work. The chickens, at least, were familiar. She'd tended them before in Thornberry. These were scrappy, half-wild birds that eyed her with suspicion, but they accepted the feed she scattered and reluctantly gave up their eggs. There were 8 hens and 1 rooster who seemed to take his protective duties very seriously. The water was harder. The bucket was heavy even empty, and by the time she'd filled it at the creek and hauled it back up the slope to the cabin, her arms were trembling. She made 3 trips, 1 for drinking water to boil, 1 for cooking, 1 for washing. By the time she'd finished, her back was aching and her dress was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. Inside the cabin, she built up the fire in the stove and set water to boil. While it heated, she explored the shelves and root cellar, taking inventory of what was available. Flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, coffee, dried beans, preserved vegetables in jars, smoked meat hanging from hooks. It was basic but adequate. She could work with this. She spent the afternoon cleaning, sweeping the packed earth floor, washing dishes that had clearly been neglected, airing out blankets, organizing the supplies in a more logical order. It was mindless work, the kind she'd done her whole life, and there was something almost comforting about it. At least she knew how to do this. At least this made sense. As evening approached, she made dinner. Beans and salt pork simmered with an onion she found in the root cellar, cornbread baked in the Dutch oven. Simple food, but filling and hot. She set the table for 2 and then sat down to wait, hoping Caleb would actually return as he'd said and that she hadn't been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting when she heard the horse. Caleb appeared through the trees, moving slowly, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He dismounted near the barn and spent several minutes tending to the horse before finally making his way to the cabin. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the set table and the food waiting. For a moment, his expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or confusion, as if he'd forgotten he'd brought someone here to cook for him. "It's ready," Martha said quietly. Caleb washed his hands in the basin by the door and sat down at the table. He ate in silence, mechanically again, but when he'd finished, he looked at her directly for the first time since that morning. "This is good," he said. "Thank you." They were simple words, but Martha felt something shift in her chest. When was the last time someone had thanked her for anything? When was the last time someone had acknowledged her work as something more than expected, more than owed? The cow, she asked, had to put her down. Poisoned somehow, ate something bad. "I'll butcher her tomorrow. We'll have fresh meat for a while." He stood and went to the door again, and Martha thought he was leaving for the barn as he had the night before. But instead, he turned back. "You did well today," he said. "The cabin hasn't looked this clean in 2 years. Hasn't smelled like real food in longer than that." Then he did leave, and Martha sat at the table in the lamplight, staring at her empty plate and trying to understand this strange, silent man who barely spoke but somehow managed to say things that mattered. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Caleb would rise before dawn, drink his coffee, and disappear into the forest or hills for the day. Martha would tend the chickens, haul water, cook, clean, and slowly begin to understand the rhythms of this isolated place. Caleb would return at dusk, eat whatever she'd prepared, exchange a few brief words, and retreat to the barn or to his bed. It wasn't companionship. It wasn't even really conversation. But it was peaceful in a way Martha had never experienced before. There were no gossips watching her every move, no constant reminders of everything she supposedly was and wasn't. There was just work and silence and the slow progression of days. On the third day, Martha opened the bundle of clothes Caleb's wife had worn. She'd been avoiding it, uncomfortable with the idea of wearing a dead woman's dresses. But her own clothes were wearing thin from constant washing, and the mountain cold was seeping through the fabric. The dresses fit. Not perfectly. Sarah had been tall where Martha was average height, and Martha was broader through the shoulders and hips, but they fit well enough. Better than anything Martha had owned in years. The fabric was good quality. Carefully mended where it had worn, and there was even a coat lined with wool. That evening, when Caleb came in for dinner, he stopped short when he saw her wearing the blue dress with the worn cuffs. "That was her favorite," he said quietly. "Then, it looks better on you." She'd be glad someone was getting use from it. Martha didn't know how to respond to that, so she just served dinner and they ate in their usual silence. But something had changed. Caleb began to linger a bit longer after meals, sometimes making observations about the ranch or the weather. Martha found herself responding, asking questions, offering opinions. The conversations were still brief and practical, but they were happening. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Caleb came in with a book under his arm. "Do you read?" he asked. "Yes." He held out the book. "Sarah loved this one. Read it so many times the spine broke. You're welcome to borrow it if you want something to do in the evenings." Martha took the book, a collection of poetry, and felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a small gesture, offering her something to read, but it suggested that Caleb had been thinking about her comfort, about what she might need beyond food and shelter. "Thank you," she managed. That night, lying in her loft by lamplight, Martha read poetry and listened to the wind in the pines outside. She could hear Caleb below, moving around the cabin in his nightly routine, and for the first time since leaving Thornberry, she felt something that might have been the beginning of safety. The feeling didn't last. 3 days later, a storm rolled down from the mountains, bringing with it sheets of rain that turned the clearing into a mud pit and made working outside impossible. Martha woke to thunder rumbling through the valley and rain hammering on the roof so loudly she could barely hear herself think. She climbed down from the loft to find Caleb already up, standing at the window and staring out at the deluge. Storm settling in, he said without turning around. Could last days. We'll need to bring in extra firewood before it gets worse. They worked together in the rain, hauling wood from the pile to stack near the door where it would stay dry. Martha's dress was soaked through in minutes, her hair plastered to her head, but Caleb didn't stop, so neither did she. By the time they'd moved enough wood to last a week, they were both shivering and covered in mud. Inside, Caleb built up the fire while Martha changed into dry clothes in the loft. When she climbed back down, he'd stripped off his wet shirt and was wringing it out over a basin, and for the first time, Martha saw the full extent of the scars that covered his back and left side. They were old, long-heeled, but vicious, the kind that came from violence, not accident. He caught her looking and pulled on a dry shirt quickly, his face carefully blank. War? Martha asked softly, among other things. He hung his wet shirt near the fire and moved to the stove. Coffee? She nodded, and they spent the rest of that day trapped inside by the storm, moving around each other in the small space with careful politeness. Caleb mended a harness. Martha altered one of Sarah's dresses to fit her better. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, weighted with questions neither was willing to ask. By evening, the rain hadn't let up. Caleb made dinner, the first time Martha had seen him cook, throwing together a simple stew with an efficiency that spoke of long practice at feeding himself. They ate at the table, and Martha became aware of how small the cabin suddenly felt, how aware she was of his presence in a way she hadn't been before. Tell me about Thornberry, Caleb said suddenly, breaking the silence. What made you leave? Martha's hands tightened on her spoon. She'd known this question would come eventually, but she still wasn't prepared for it. I didn't leave, she said carefully. I was sent away, by a man who needed me gone. She kept her eyes on her bowl. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and it was easier to make me disappear than to let me talk about it. What did you see? Martha hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. The banker with another man's wife. Nothing dramatic. But he had a reputation to protect and I didn't. So they planted evidence in my room, called me a thief, and arranged for me to go west before anyone could ask questions. She looked up to find Caleb watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Did you tell them it was a lie? He asked. Who would have believed me? Martha's voice came out harder than she intended. I was the big girl from the laundry. They'd been calling me greedy my whole life. Of course I was a thief. It made sense to them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. The world's got no kindness for people who don't fit into its neat little boxes. I'm sorry that happened to you, Martha blinked, startled by the apology. It's not your fault, no. But someone should say it's wrong. Someone should acknowledge that you didn't deserve it. He stood abruptly and carried his bowl to the basin. For what it's worth, I'm glad you ended up here instead of wherever else they might have sent you. The words hung in the air between them, surprisingly intimate for such a simple statement. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the dim lamplight that might hide it. The storm continued for 3 more days. The creek swelled and rushed, threatening to overflow its banks. The clearing became a lake of mud. And Martha and Caleb were trapped together in the cabin. Learning to navigate each other's presence in close quarters, on the second day, Caleb taught her to shoot. They stood under the overhang by the barn, and he showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. His hands were careful when he adjusted her grip, impersonal but not cold, and Martha found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact. You're stronger than you think, he said as she struggled with the rifle's weight. Stop apologizing for taking up space. Just hold it. She hit the target, a board propped against a stump, on her 5th try, and the satisfaction she felt was unexpected and fierce. On the 3rd day, they read together. Caleb had pulled out a battered copy of a novel, and when Martha expressed interest, He'd suggested they take turns reading aloud to pass the time. So they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace, the book traveling back and forth between them, and Martha discovered that Caleb had a good voice for reading, deep and measured, with none of the stumbling that suggested he was uncomfortable with words. When it was her turn to read, she was self-conscious at first, aware of his attention on her. But as she got lost in the story, she forgot to be nervous, and when she looked up after finishing a chapter, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You have a nice voice," he said. "Sarah used to read to me at night." I'd forgotten how much I missed it. It was the first time he'd volunteered information about his late wife, and Martha held very still, afraid of breaking whatever spell had loosened his tongue. "How did she die?" she asked carefully. Caleb's face closed down immediately, and Martha regretted the question. But after a moment, he answered, "Fever. Came on sudden, she was fine one morning and burning up by nightfall. I rode to Broken Creek for the doctor, but the storm that winter made the trail impassable. By the time I got back 3 days later." He stopped, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "She was already gone. Buried her up on the hill behind the cabin where she liked to watch the sunset." "I'm sorry," Martha said, and meant it. "Everyone's sorry," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't change the fact that I failed her when she needed me most." He stood and walked to the door, staring out at the rain. "People in Broken Creek said I was cursed after that. Said terrible things happened to anyone who got close to me. Maybe they were right." Martha set the book aside and stood, moving closer to him but not touching. "Or maybe terrible things just happen sometimes, and it's not anyone's fault. Not everything needs a reason or someone to blame." Caleb turned to look at her, and for a moment, the guard he kept on his emotions slipped. She saw grief there, and guilt, and a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was no heat in it. "Maybe not. But I know what it's like to be blamed for things I didn't do. To be called cursed just for existing in a way that makes people uncomfortable. If you're cursed, Caleb Harlan, then so am I." Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and turned back to the rain. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, and Caleb immediately threw himself into catching up on neglected work. He left at dawn and didn't return until well after dark, and when he did, he was so exhausted he barely spoke before collapsing into bed. Martha told herself she wasn't disappointed by his absence, that she hadn't grown accustomed to his company, but she knew she was lying. As autumn deepened into winter, the work changed. Martha helped Caleb slaughter chickens and preserve the meat. They smoked venison from the deer he'd hunted. She learned to make soap and candles. Skills she'd never needed in town where such things could be bought. The garden needed to be put to bed for winter, the root cellar stocked and organized, the cabin prepared for the months when snow would make leaving difficult or impossible. Through it all, she and Caleb developed an easy partnership built on shared labor and growing trust. He still didn't talk much, but his silences felt comfortable now rather than hostile. And when he did speak, he often surprised her with observations that revealed a sharp intelligence and a dry sense of humor she hadn't expected. One afternoon in late October, they were working together to repair the chicken coop's roof before the first snow arrived. Martha was holding a board in place while Caleb hammered, and she found herself watching the sure, competent way he worked, the strength in his hands and arms. When he caught her staring, she looked away quickly, embarrassed. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. Just thinking about." Martha hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than deflection. "About how strange this is. Being here with you. A month ago, I didn't know you existed. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Caleb set down the hammer and looked at her directly. "You could leave if you wanted. I wouldn't stop you. Wouldn't even blame you. This is a hard life, and I'm not easy company. Where would I go?" Martha asked. "Back to Thornberry." To another town where I'd be the same invisible, disposable woman I was before. She shook her head. At least here I'm useful. At least here I'm treated like a person instead of a problem. You were always a person, Martha. Other people's blindness doesn't change that. The way he said her name, with such casual certainty, made something warm bloom in her chest. She'd heard her name spoken 1,000 different ways, with contempt, with dismissal, with impatience, but never quite like this. Never like it was simply a fact, neutral and acknowledged. You're the first person who's ever made me believe that, she said softly. Caleb picked up the hammer again. But his movements were slower now, more careful. Then you've known the wrong people. That night, Martha lay in her loft and admitted to herself what she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. She was developing feelings for Caleb, feelings that went beyond gratitude or companionship. She noticed things about him now that she hadn't before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something genuinely amused him. The gentleness in his rough hands when he handled an injured animal. The way he'd started leaving small things for her, a particularly nice piece of wood for whittling, wildflowers in a jar on the table, an extra blanket when the nights turned cold. It was dangerous to let herself feel this way. She knew that. She'd learned long ago that desire and tenderness weren't meant for women like her. And even if they were, Caleb was still grieving his wife. He'd given no indication that he saw Martha as anything more than hired help, a solution to a practical problem. But lying there in the dark, listening to him move around below, Martha let herself imagine for just a moment what it might be like if things were different. If he looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the mountains at sunset, with appreciation and wonder. If his careful distance was protection rather than indifference, then she pushed the thoughts away and tried to sleep, because hoping for impossible things had never brought her anything but pain. The first snow came in early November, arriving overnight and transforming the world into something silent and strange. Martha woke to unusual brightness in the loft and climbed down to find Caleb already up, staring out the window at a landscape buried under 6 inches of white. Beautiful, she breathed, pressing her face close to the glass. And dangerous, Caleb said. We'll need to check on the animals, make sure nothing's gotten trapped or injured. Stay close to me. It's easy to get disoriented in snow this heavy, and there's cliffs nearby that don't look like cliffs when they're covered. They bundled up and ventured out into a world muffled and transformed. The barn animals were fine. Huddled together for warmth. The chickens were indignant about the cold but unharmed. Caleb led Martha on a wider circuit of the property, checking fence lines and looking for any cattle that might have wandered too close to danger. They were on their way back to the cabin when Martha's foot broke through a hidden drift and she went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. Pain shot up her leg and she cried out, more from surprise than hurt, but Caleb was beside her instantly. Don't move, he ordered, his hands already checking her ankle with practiced efficiency. Can you wiggle your toes? She could, though it hurt. Caleb probed gently around the joint, and Martha bit her lip to keep from making noise. Not broken, he said finally. But it's going to swell and you won't be walking on it for a few days. He stood and, without warning or asking permission, bent and lifted her into his arms. Martha went rigid with shock. No one had carried her since she was a small child. No one had tried. She was too big, too heavy, too much. But Caleb lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his arms steady beneath her, and started walking back toward the cabin without any apparent strain. I'm too heavy, she protested, her face burning. Put me down, I can walk. You can't, Caleb said shortly. And you're not too heavy. Stop arguing and let me help you. The walk back to the cabin seemed to take forever and no time at all. Martha was excruciatingly aware of how close she was to him, of the way her body pressed against his chest, of the strength in the arms that held her. She kept her eyes fixed on the tree line and tried to ignore the way her heart was racing. Inside, Caleb set her carefully on his bed, the only real bed in the cabin, and went to work with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. He removed her boot, packed snow around her ankle to reduce the swelling, and wrapped it snugly with strips of clean cloth. "You'll need to stay off it," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Keep it elevated." "I'll handle the chores for the next few days. I can still cook," Martha protested. "I can do things sitting down. You can rest," Caleb said firmly. "You work harder than anyone I've ever met. A few days of rest won't kill you." He brought her water and food and books and made sure the fire stayed built up. When evening came and Martha tried to insist she could climb to the loft, he simply shook his head. "You're staying in the bed." "I'll sleep by the fire." "That's ridiculous. It's your bed, and you're injured." "It's not a debate, Martha." So she spent that night in Caleb's bed, surrounded by the scent of him, wood smoke and pine and something earthier, and tried not to think about what it meant that he'd carried her without hesitation, that he was sleeping on the hard floor rather than let her be uncomfortable. That he was taking care of her with a tenderness she'd never experienced before. Over the next 3 days, as her ankle healed and the snow continued to fall, Martha observed a different side of Caleb. He was patient with her frustration at being unable to help. He brought her meals and sat with her while she ate, their conversations growing longer and more personal. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about the war and what he'd seen there, about meeting Sarah at a dance and knowing immediately that she was the one person who might understand the darkness he carried. "She wasn't afraid of me," he said quietly one evening, sitting in the chair beside the bed while firelight played across his face. "Everyone else who looked at me saw something broken or dangerous. She just saw me." "I see you," Martha said before she could stop herself. Caleb's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb stood abruptly. "I should check the animals one more time before bed," he said, and left her alone with her racing heart and the growing certainty that she was falling for a man who was still in love with a ghost. By the time her ankle had healed enough for Martha to resume her normal work, something fundamental had shifted between them. Caleb was more careful around her now, more distant, as if her words that night had frightened him into rebuilding walls she'd thought were coming down. He took his meals quickly and found reasons to be outside longer. When they were together in the cabin, he barely looked at her. Martha told herself it didn't matter, that she'd been foolish to let herself hope for anything more than what they already had. But it hurt in a way she hadn't expected, this new coldness after the warmth they'd been building. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination, trying to prove that she was valuable, necessary, worth keeping around even if he didn't want her in any other way. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snows that sometimes kept them trapped inside for days at a time. The silence between them grew oppressive. Martha would catch Caleb watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't read. But whenever she met his eyes, he'd look away quickly and find something else to occupy his attention. It was during one of these snowbound stretches, on a gray afternoon when the wind howled outside and the cabin felt smaller than ever, that everything came to a head. Martha was mending a shirt by lamplight when Caleb suddenly stood from where he'd been sitting by the fire and crossed to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "This isn't working," he said, his voice tight. Martha's hand stilled on the fabric. Her heart began to pound with sick dread. This was it, then. He was going to send her away, back to Broken Creek or Thornberry or anywhere that wasn't here. She'd let herself care too much. Shown too much, and now she was going to pay the price. "I understand," she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I can leave when the weather clears." Caleb turned to stare at her, his expression shocked. "Leave? Why the hell would you leave? You just said it isn't working." "I didn't mean." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I'm not talking about you working here. I'm talking about me trying to keep distance between us when all I want is to stop keeping distance." Martha set down the mending with trembling hands. "I don't understand." Caleb crossed the room until he stood in front of her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. His eyes were stormy, conflicted, but underneath the turmoil was something that made her breath catch, want, raw and undisguised. "I'm trying to be honorable," he said roughly. You came here because you had no choice. Because men in power decided your life didn't matter. I won't be another man who takes advantage of you just because I can. But God help me, Martha, I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting to touch you, too." He broke off, his jaw clenched. "You deserve better than a broken widower in the middle of nowhere who doesn't know how to be anything but alone." Martha stood slowly, her healing ankle protesting but holding her weight. She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. Feeling the rough stubble there, the heat of his skin, "Maybe I don't want better," she said. "Maybe I just want you." The words hung between them for a heartbeat. Then Caleb made a sound that was half groan, half surrender, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and hungry, two people who'd been starving themselves finally allowing themselves to feed. His hands came up to frame her face, then slid into her hair, scattering pins and loosening the tight bun she always wore. Martha's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and when he lifted her, just as he had in the snow, she went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck. He carried her to his bed and set her down carefully. Then pulled back, breathing hard. "Tell me to stop," he said hoarsely. "Tell me this isn't what you want, and I'll walk away right now. I'll never mention it again. But if you don't stop me now, Martha, I won't be able to stop myself." "I don't want you to stop," Martha said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and fierce and nothing like what Martha had imagined intimacy would be. Caleb touched her like she was precious, kissing every inch of skin he revealed as he slowly removed her clothes. When she started to cover herself, self-conscious about her body, he caught her hands. "Don't," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't hide from me. You're beautiful, Martha. Every part of you." She wanted to argue, to list all the ways she didn't fit the definition of beautiful, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it. He saw her, really saw her, and wasn't repulsed or disappointed. He wanted her exactly as she was. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the fire burning low and the wind still howling outside. Caleb's hand traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and Martha felt more at peace than she had in her entire life. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again," Caleb said quietly. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of me died too. That I'd just exist until I stopped existing, working this ranch until my body gave out." "What changed?" Martha asked. "You." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You showed up damaged and weary and determined not to be broken, and you reminded me what it felt like to want to be alive. To want a future instead of just enduring the present." Martha turned in his arms to face him. "I was so afraid you only saw me as help. As someone useful but not desirable. I've wanted you since the day you climbed down from that loft in Sarah's dress and looked at me like you were ready to fight the world if it came after you again." Caleb's thumb brushed across her cheek. "I was just too scared to admit it. Scared of betraying Sarah's memory. Scared of messing this up and driving you away. Scared that if I let myself care about someone again, I'd lose them too." "You might," Martha said honestly. "Life doesn't come with guarantees. But being afraid of loss doesn't protect you from it. It just means you miss out on everything good while you're waiting for the bad." Caleb kissed her again, slower this time, deeper. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid." They stayed in bed as evening fell into night, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Caleb told her about the scars on his back, a Confederate prison camp where he'd been held for 8 months before being released in a prisoner exchange. Martha told him about her childhood. About her mother's quiet desperation and the way the town had treated them both with contempt disguised as charity. "I used to think if I could just be good enough, work hard enough, take up less space, they'd finally see me as worthy," Martha said. "It took me 28 years to realize that their judgment had nothing to do with who I actually was. They needed someone to look down on, and I was convenient." "Their loss," Caleb said firmly. "My gain," It was simple and honest and more romantic than any poetry Martha had ever read. The next morning, they woke tangled together, and for a moment, Martha feared that daylight would bring regret or awkwardness. But Caleb just smiled at her, a real smile. Unguarded and warm, and kissed her good morning before getting up to build the fire. They fell into a new routine, one that included stolen kisses while doing chores and hands held across the dinner table. Caleb became more talkative, sharing stories and observations he'd kept locked inside. Martha found herself laughing more, relaxing into a version of herself she'd never known existed, confident, desired, free, but their peace couldn't last forever. The world they tried to leave behind wasn't content to let them hide. It was mid-January when the riders came. Martha was in the chicken coop, collecting eggs, when she heard horses approaching. She stepped outside to see 3 men on horseback entering the clearing. Their breath and the horses' breath creating clouds in the frigid air. One of them was Sheriff Coleman from Thornbury. Her blood turned to ice. Caleb emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held loosely at his side. He positioned himself between Martha and the riders, and she saw his shoulders set in that way that meant he was preparing for trouble. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, his eyes finding Martha over Caleb's shoulder. "We're here for Martha Bell. She needs to come back to Thornbury to face additional charges." "What charges?" Martha asked, finding her voice despite her fear. "Seems after you left, more items went missing from the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson believes you may have taken them before your departure. We need you to return and answer questions." It was a lie. Martha could see it in the way Coleman wouldn't quite meet her eyes. This wasn't about theft. This was about silencing her permanently, about making sure she could never come back and tell the truth about what she'd seen. "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said flatly. Coleman's hand moved to rest on his gun. "That's not your decision, friend. I have the authority to bring her back by force if necessary." "You have no authority here," Caleb said. "This is territorial land, outside your jurisdiction. You're a town sheriff, not a marshal. You've got no legal right to take her." One of the other riders, a man Martha didn't recognize, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mr. Garrett sent us to collect what belongs to him. He paid good money for her passage and her keep. Far as we're concerned, that makes her his property until the debt is repaid." The casual way he said it, property, made Martha's stomach turn. But it also sparked something hot and fierce in her chest. She'd spent her whole life being treated as less than human, and she was done with it. She stepped out from behind Caleb, ignoring his low warning. "I don't belong to Mr. Garrett or anyone else. I'm not property. I'm a person, and I'm staying here." Coleman's expression hardened. "Girl, you don't want to make this difficult. We can do this easy, or we can do it hard, but either way, you're coming back." "No," Martha said, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. "I'm not. You want to know why?" "Because I saw Mr. Garrett with Elizabeth Morrison in that private dining room. I saw how he was touching her, how she was laughing, how neither of them cared that he has a wife and 3 children at home. That's why he wants me gone. Not because I stole anything, I never stole anything, but because I know the truth about him." Coleman's face flushed. "You're lying. Making up stories to avoid facing justice, am I?" Martha took another step forward. "Then why did you plant that spoon in my room? Why did you wait until I was gone to accuse me of stealing more? Why come all the way out here in the middle of winter unless you're desperate to keep me quiet?" The third rider, younger than the others, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Martha saw doubt flicker across his face and pressed her advantage. "I'm not going back," she repeated. "If you want to drag me, you'll have to do it by force, and Mr. Harlan here is a crack shot. I imagine his bullets travel faster than your horses can run. So you have a choice. You can go back to Thornbury and tell Mr. Garrett that I'm staying here where I'm safe and I have witnesses to the truth. Or you can try to take me and see how that works out for you." It was the longest speech Martha had ever made, and by the end of it, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. But she didn't back down, didn't lower her eyes, didn't make herself small. Caleb moved to stand beside her, not in front of her but next to her, a united front. "You heard the lady. She's staying. And I'll add that if word somehow gets back to the territorial governor about a town banker covering up an affair by falsely accusing an innocent woman and trying to force her into servitude, I imagine he'd be very interested. Especially since I believe the governor is a friend of Mrs. Morrison's father. Powerful man, from what I hear." It was a bluff. Martha had no idea who Mrs. Morrison's father was, but it landed. She saw Coleman and the other riders exchange glances, saw the calculation happening behind their eyes. Was silencing one inconvenient woman worth the risk of exposing Garrett's scandal to someone with real power? "This isn't over," Coleman said finally, but there was no conviction in it. He was already backing down, already deciding that Martha Bell wasn't worth the trouble after all. "Yes, it is," Caleb said. "And if anyone from Thornberry shows up here again uninvited, they'll be met with force. This is my land, and Martha is under my protection. Spread that word when you get back." The three men remounted and turned their horses, and Martha watched them ride away until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did her knees start to shake, the adrenaline that had kept her upright suddenly draining away. Caleb caught her as she swayed, pulling her against his chest. "You were magnificent," he said into her hair. "I've never seen anyone stand up like that. You were fearless." "I was terrified," Martha admitted, her voice muffled against his coat. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's being scared and doing the right thing anyway." He pulled back to look at her. "You faced them down, told the truth, and claimed your right to choose your own life. That's more than most people ever manage." Martha let herself lean into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Do you think they'll come back?" "No. You exposed the real reason they wanted you gone. Garrett won't risk his reputation by pushing harder. And if he does..." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "If he does, I'll make sure he regrets it. You're not alone anymore, Martha. You don't have to fight by yourself." They stood there in the cold for a long time, holding each other while the horses stamped and snorted in the barn and the chickens clucked indignantly about their interrupted routine. When they finally went inside, Caleb made coffee and they sat at the table, their hands clasped between them. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. "About why I really came out here, why I left civilization behind." Martha waited, sensing this was important. "After the war, I came home different. Saw things differently. The violence. The casual cruelty, it was everywhere, and I couldn't unsee it. I tried to work as a lawman, thought maybe I could make things better. But the law protects property and power, not people. Not the ones who need protecting most." He stared into his coffee. "I arrested a man once for beating his wife half to death. 2 days later, he was free and she was dead. The judge said it was a domestic matter, not really a crime. I broke the man's jaw after that, lost my badge, and nearly went to prison myself." "Sarah convinced you to leave?" Martha guessed. Sarah understood that if I stayed, I'd end up dead or in prison. "So we came here, built this place, tried to make a life away from all of it." His eyes met Martha's. "When she died, I thought I'd failed again. Failed to protect someone I loved. Failed to keep her safe. I was ready to just give up, let this place fall apart around me, but you didn't, no. Because as much as I wanted to quit, I couldn't betray what she'd wanted for me. She wanted me to live, not just survive. And then you showed up, and I realized I could do both. I could live and help someone else do the same." Martha squeezed his hands. "We're both running from things. Both trying to build something better than what we left behind. Then let's build it together," Caleb said. "Not as employer and employee, not as temporary arrangement, but as partners. As people who chose each other, It wasn't a proposal exactly, but it was close enough. It was a promise of a shared future, of facing whatever came next as a team. Yes, Martha said simply. Yes to all of it. That night, as they lay in bed with the fire burning low and the wind quiet outside, Martha thought about how far she'd come from the woman who'd stood in Thornberry's muddy street 4 months ago. That woman had believed she was worthless, unlovable, destined for a life of invisible servitude. This woman, the one who'd faced down 3 men and claimed her right to exist, knew better. She wasn't the woman no one wanted anymore. She was the woman who'd learned to want herself. To see her own value, to take up the space she deserved. And she'd found someone who saw that value too, who cherished rather than tolerated her presence. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be more struggles, more challenges, more days when survival felt like victory. But it was real, and it was hers, and that was more than enough. Winter deepened after the confrontation with the men from Thornberry, and with it came a peace that Martha had never known existed. The snow piled higher against the cabin walls, sometimes drifting so deep that Caleb had to dig paths to the barn and chicken coop every morning. They were completely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, and Martha found that she didn't mind at all. Here in their small cabin with the fire burning and the wind howling outside, she'd found something more valuable than acceptance or approval. She'd found home. The days took on a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. They woke together in the pre-dawn darkness, Caleb's arm warm around her waist. They dressed and started the fire and shared coffee while the world outside slowly lightened from black to gray to the blinding white of snow under winter sun. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized from months of partnership. And at night, they came together with a tenderness that still surprised Martha, still made her breath catch when Caleb touched her like she was something precious. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Caleb pulled out a small wooden box that Martha had never seen before. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, before opening it to reveal a simple gold ring. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly. "Her wedding ring. I've been carrying it around since she died, couldn't decide what to do with it. Felt wrong to sell it or bury it with her. But I think I finally know what she would have wanted." He held the ring up to the firelight, and Martha could see the worn smoothness of the gold, the way it had been shaped by years of wear. Sarah used to say that love wasn't about holding on to the past or being afraid of the future. It was about honoring what was and being brave enough to embrace what could be. Caleb looked at Martha, his blue eyes serious. "She would have liked you. Would have wanted me to be happy again. Would have wanted this ring to mean something instead of just sitting in a box collecting dust." Martha's throat tightened. "Caleb, I can't. I'm not asking you to replace her," he said quickly. "No one could do that, and I wouldn't want them to. But I am asking you to marry me. To make this official. To build a life here together, not as employer and employee or even just as lovers, but as partners in every sense of the word." Martha stared at the ring, then at Caleb, unable to form words around the emotion clogging her throat. Marriage. He was asking her to marry him. The big girl from the laundry that no one had ever wanted was being asked to become someone's wife. "I don't have anything to offer you," she finally managed. "No dowry, no family connections, no, you have yourself," Caleb interrupted. "Your strength, your kindness, your courage. You have hands that turn this cabin into a home and a presence that makes me want to be better than I am. That's more than enough. That's everything." Martha reached out with trembling fingers and took the ring from his palm. It was warm from his touch, solid and real. She thought about Sarah, the woman who'd worn this ring before her, who'd loved this complicated man and made a life with him in this wild place. She sent up a silent thank you to that unknown woman for teaching Caleb how to love, for making him capable of opening his heart again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb's face transformed with a smile that took years off his weathered features. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but Martha didn't care. and kissed her with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said against her lips. "Never thought I deserved it." "We both deserve it," Martha said firmly. "We both deserve to be happy." They made plans that night, talking until the fire burned low and the cold started creeping back into the cabin. When the spring thaw came, they would ride to Broken Creek and find someone to perform the ceremony. It wouldn't be fancy, Martha didn't want fancy, but it would be real and legal and binding. They talked about expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and maybe a room for children if they were blessed with them. They talked about increasing the herd, about putting in a larger garden, about all the practical details of building a future together, but underlying all of it was a truth that went beyond plans and practicalities. They were choosing each other, deliberately and completely, and that choice mattered more than anything else. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. The snow began to melt during the day, refreezing at night and creating treacherous ice patches everywhere. The creek swelled with runoff, rushing and tumbling over rocks that had been silent under ice for months. And Martha noticed changes in her own body that made her both terrified and excited. She waited until she was certain before telling Caleb. They were sitting on the porch one evening, wrapped in blankets and watching the sun set behind the mountains, when she finally found the courage to speak. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Caleb went very still beside her. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. I've missed my courses twice now, and I've been sick in the mornings, and..." She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "I can feel it. I know it sounds strange, but I can feel that something's different. How do you feel about it?" Caleb asked carefully. "This wasn't planned. If you're not ready, if you don't want, I want it," Martha said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I never thought I'd have a child. Never thought anyone would want to make that kind of life with me. But now that it's happening, I realize I want it more than I knew I could want anything." Caleb pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her from behind, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "Then we'll make it work. We'll get you to a doctor, make sure everything's healthy. We'll prepare. We'll do whatever needs to be done." Martha leaned back against his chest and felt something knot inside her that had been tight her whole life. This was real. This life they were building was real. She was going to be a mother, and her child would never know what it felt like to be unwanted or invisible. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Caleb said. "But we'll figure it out together." That's what we do. The next morning, Caleb rode to Broken Creek to arrange for their marriage and to send word to the nearest doctor about Martha's pregnancy. He returned 3 days later with news that the traveling doctor would be in Broken Creek the following month and could examine her then. He'd also found a minister who agreed to perform a wedding ceremony whenever they were ready. "I got you something else," Caleb said, pulling a package from his saddlebag. Inside was fabric, good quality cotton in a soft blue, enough for a dress. "Thought you might want something new for the wedding. Something that's just yours, not Sarah's." The gesture moved Martha more than she could express. She'd grown comfortable wearing Sarah's clothes, had even come to think of them fondly as hand-me-downs from a friend she'd never met. But having something new, something chosen specifically for her, felt significant in a way she couldn't quite name. She spent the next 2 weeks sewing the dress, taking her time with each stitch, making it exactly how she wanted. She made it to fit her body as it was, not trying to hide or minimize her size but instead celebrating the strength and capability that had kept her alive through so many hard years. When she finally tried it on, standing in front of the small mirror Caleb had hung near the window, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was healthy and strong, with color in her cheeks and a softness around her eyes that came from being regularly fed and regularly loved. Her body, which she'd spent so long trying to make invisible, looked powerful in the well-fitted dress. She looked like someone who belonged in her own skin, who had earned her place in the world. "You're beautiful," Caleb said from behind her, and when Martha met his eyes in the mirror, she saw that he meant it. They married on a clear day in early April, when the last patches of snow were melting and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud. The ceremony took place in Broken Creek's small trading post, witnessed by the storekeeper and his wife and 2 trappers who happened to be in town. The minister was an old man with kind eyes who didn't ask questions about Martha's past or why they were getting married so far from civilization. Martha wore her blue dress and Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, and they spoke their vows with hands clasped and eyes locked on each other. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with such tenderness that Martha felt tears slip down her cheeks. "You're crying," Caleb whispered, wiping them away with his thumb. "I'm happy," Martha said, and realized it was true. She was happy in a way she'd never imagined possible. They stayed in Broken Creek overnight, their wedding night spent in a real bed in the boarding house, and the next morning, they met with the doctor who'd arrived the day before. He examined Martha and confirmed what she already knew. She was about 3 months along, healthy and strong, and if all went well, the baby would come in early September. "You'll need to take care," the doctor warned. "Being so isolated isn't ideal for a first birth. If complications arise, you'll have no help." "I'll be fine," Martha said with more confidence than she felt. "Women have been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time." "That's true," the doctor acknowledged. "But many of them don't survive it. Promise me you'll come to Broken Creek when your time gets close. Stay here where I can check on you and help if needed." Martha looked at Caleb, who nodded. "We'll come," he promised. "A month before, maybe 6 weeks. Whatever's safest." On the ride back to the ranch, Martha felt like a different person than the one who'd made this journey 5 months ago. Then, she'd been running from shame and false accusations, uncertain of her future and convinced of her own worthlessness. Now, she was returning as someone's wife, carrying their child, heading toward a home she'd helped build. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked as they rode through the spring-green forest. "About how strange life is," Martha said. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing. If Mr. Garrett hadn't needed me gone, if Sheriff Coleman hadn't planted that evidence, I'd still be in Thornberry washing other people's laundry and believing that was all I deserved." "Everything happens for a reason," Caleb said, then shook his head. "No, that's not right. Terrible things happen without reason. But we can choose what we do with them. We can let them destroy us, or we can use them as fuel to build something better." "Is that what we're doing?" "Building something better, every day," Caleb said. "Every day we choose each other, choose this life, choose to keep trying despite everything that's tried to break us. That's what makes it meaningful." Summer arrived with long, golden days and work that seemed endless but satisfying. Martha's belly swelled with the growing baby. And Caleb became increasingly protective, taking over the heavier chores and insisting she rest more than she wanted to. They expanded the cabin as planned, adding a bedroom and a small nursery. Caleb built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving small designs into the headboard, mountains and trees and stars. "It's beautiful," Martha said, running her fingers over the intricate work. "So are you," Caleb replied, and pulled her into his arms despite her protests that she was too big and awkward now. "I'm huge," she said against his chest. "You're perfect," he corrected. "You're growing our child. You're strong and healthy and more beautiful now than the day I met you." Martha had learned to accept his compliments without arguing, had learned that his desire for her wasn't conditional or temporary. Even now, heavy with pregnancy and moving awkwardly, Caleb touched her with reverence, kissed her with passion, made her feel wanted in ways that still took her breath away. In late August, as planned, they made the journey to Broken Creek. The trading post owner had a cabin he rented out, and Caleb paid for a month's stay. The doctor checked Martha regularly, proclaimed her and the baby healthy, and predicted a normal delivery. "Your wife is strong," he told Caleb. "She'll do fine." Martha liked hearing that, "your wife." She liked the casual assumption of belonging. The legal and social recognition of what she and Caleb had built. She was no longer invisible or disposable. She was Mrs. Harlan, with a husband who loved her and a child on the way and a future that stretched out before her full of possibility. The baby came on a cool September night, arriving after 12 hours of labor that tested every bit of Martha's strength. Caleb stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and wiping her face and refusing to leave despite the doctor's suggestions that he wait elsewhere. When their daughter finally slipped into the world, red-faced and wailing, Martha wept with relief and joy and a love so fierce it felt like it might consume her. "She's perfect," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion as he held the tiny bundle. "She looks just like you, poor thing," Martha joked weakly, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "Lucky thing," Caleb corrected, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead before placing her in Martha's arms. "She got your strength, your beauty, your stubbornness. She's going to be unstoppable." They named her Sarah Rose, Sarah for the woman whose ring Martha wore and whose memory had helped Caleb learn to love again, Rose for Martha's mother who'd worked herself to death trying to give her daughter a better life. The baby was the bridge between past and future, between grief and hope, between what had been and what could be. When they returned to the ranch 3 weeks later, Martha carried her daughter through the door and felt the rightness of it settle deep in her bones. This was where they belonged. This cabin, this clearing, these mountains. This life they'd built from pain and determination and the stubborn refusal to let the world tell them they weren't enough. That first night home, after Sarah Rose was settled in her cradle and the fire was banked for the evening, Martha and Caleb sat on the porch wrapped in blankets and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about Thornberry?" Caleb asked. "About the life you left behind?" "Sometimes," Martha admitted. "But not with regret. More with a kind of distant gratitude that it pushed me here. That it forced me to leave so I could find this. Do you think you'll ever go back? Face the people who wronged you?" Martha considered the question. Part of her wanted to return triumphant, to show them all that she'd survived and thrived despite their cruelty. But a larger part of her recognized that revenge or vindication would be hollow victories. The people of Thornberry had lost her, not the other way around. They'd thrown away a hard-working, honest woman because it was convenient, and they'd have to live with that choice. She didn't need their apologies or their recognition to know her worth. "No," she said finally. "My life isn't there anymore. It's here, with you and Sarah Rose and whatever future we build together. Let them think whatever they want about me. Their opinions stopped mattering the day I realized I had value beyond their approval." Caleb pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Inside the cabin, Sarah Rose made small sounds in her sleep, the precious noises of a brand new life. The chickens were settled in their coop. The horses were safe in the barn. The garden that Martha had tended all summer was full of vegetables they'd spend the fall preserving. Everything they needed was right here, earned through their own labor and commitment. Martha thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd stood in Thornberry Street and believed herself worthless, who'd let herself be sent away without a fight, who'd expected nothing but more of the same treatment she'd always received. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. The woman she'd become was stronger, braver, more certain of her place in the world. She'd learned that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for. She'd learned that her body, so often criticized and condemned, was capable of incredible things. It had survived hardship, created life, worked tirelessly to build a home. It deserved respect and care and love, not shame. She'd learned that desire wasn't something that happened despite her size but could exist because of who she was as a whole person. Caleb wanted her not in spite of her body but as part of the complete package of strength and intelligence and resilience that made her who she was. Most importantly, she'd learned that she was enough. Not because someone else had finally deemed her acceptable, but because she'd decided for herself that her existence had value. She'd stopped waiting for permission to live fully and had simply started living. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, echoing his question from months earlier. "About how far we've come," Martha said. "About how much has changed. About how grateful I am that the worst thing led to the best thing, Caleb repeated softly. I like that. They sat together under the stars, two people who'd been broken by the world and had found each other in the wilderness. Two people who'd learned that love wasn't about rescue or salvation but about recognition and partnership. Two people who'd claimed their right to happiness despite everyone who tried to convince them they didn't deserve it. Inside the cabin, their daughter slept peacefully, warm and safe and wanted. Outside, the frontier stretched vast and untamed in all directions. And here, in this small clearing carved from the forest, Martha Bell Harlan had finally found the one thing she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. She'd found home. Not a place, exactly, though the cabin and the land were part of it. Home was this feeling of belonging, of being seen and cherished, of having someone to stand beside when the world got hard. Home was knowing that no matter what came next, and there would be challenges, she had no illusions about that, she wouldn't face it alone. The woman no one wanted had become the woman who knew her own worth. The exile had become the architect of her own life. The big girl from the laundry had transformed into a wife, a mother, a partner in building something that would last, and as Martha sat on that porch with her husband's arm around her and her daughter sleeping nearby, she understood that this was what it meant to be chosen. Not because she'd changed who she was to fit someone else's expectations, but because she'd finally stopped shrinking herself and had found someone brave enough to love her at full size. The frontier stretched out before them, wild and dangerous and full of possibility. But Martha wasn't afraid anymore. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, capable of surviving anything life threw at her. More than that, she'd learned that survival wasn't enough. She deserved to thrive, to love, to take up space in the world without apology, and here, in this life she and Caleb had built together, that's exactly what she planned to do.